You close your eyes tonight thinking the world outside them is real, that the moments you recall, your first breath, your first loss, the scent of a room that no longer exists, are yours because you lived them. But what if none of it ever happened? What if your entire life is just a recollection of a memory that was never real to begin with? A copy of something, but not from you, not from anyone. Just echoes of events that were never witnessed, recorded by a mind that simply needed to fill the silence. This is not a story of forgetting. It's a story of remembering something that never was. In this slow unraveling, you'll drift through experiments in neuroscience, memory distortions, and the haunting loops of consciousness that suggest everything you know might be a second-hand illusion, not a lie, just an accidental truth mistaken for memory. If you're ready, we'll begin, not at the beginning, but at a replica without an origin. Because that sits where you might be right now. A dream inside a duplicate, a placeholder where a life should have been. Let's begin. Close your eyes and try to remember your earliest moment, not your earliest memory exactly, but the first presence, the first breath you're absolutely sure belonged to you. Most people can't, not clearly. What we call our beginning is usually a fog stitched together from photographs, stories told by others, or fragments we've imagined into certainty. It is not a beginning, it's a reconstruction, a replica of something we never fully lived. Now consider this. What if even that reconstruction isn't based on anything that ever occurred? What if your entire life is an echo of events that never took place, a copy of a memory, yes, but with no original to trace it back to? Psychologists call it cryptomnesia when you remember something without realizing it was never yours, but there's something deeper happening in the brain, a phenomenon where the mind confabulates, inventing continuity out of noise. You wake each day thinking you are the sum of your experiences, when in truth, your mind is the author of many events you simply believe you lived. This illusion is powerful because it's so useful. It keeps you anchored in identity. It tells you where you've been and why you are the way you are. But origins, in the neurological sense, are optional. Your brain can generate coherent memory traces from fragmented perception, from suggestion, from repetition. It can fill in the gaps so convincingly that even brain scans show no difference between a memory you lived and one implanted through suggestion. In one famous study, researchers successfully convinced participants they had been lost in a mall as children. With nothing but suggestive phrasing and repeated questioning, participants eventually created detailed emotional recollections of the event, recollections of an event that never happened. Your memory is not a library. It's a screenplay. It edits for coherence. It deletes contradictions. It rewrites the ending to match the middle. And if necessary, it invents the beginning entirely. That's why this replica you live in, this sequence of known events, feels so stable, because it was designed to feel that way. Not by some external force, but by your own mind attempting to rescue you from uncertainty. A memory with no origin is less threatening than a life with no continuity. But let's push this further. Imagine waking up in a life where everyone knows you, where there are photographs of your childhood, records of your schooling, friends who remember growing up with you, and yet you don't remember any of it. At first, you'd assume amnesia. But what if that was never the case? What if your presence in this timeline was new, and everything else was constructed retroactively just for your arrival? You don't need to believe in sci-fi to entertain this. Consider the possibility through the lens of how your sense of self operates. Neuroscientists studying episodic memory, the system in your brain responsible for reliving the past, have found that it is also the system used to simulate the future. The same brain regions light up whether you remember or imagine. That's how slippery memory is. It borrows the same neurological tools used to fantasize. So if your memories are indistinguishable from imagination on a neural level, what makes them real? Is it consistency, repetition, emotional charge? All of those things can be artificially produced. Actors weep for roles they never lived. Trauma victims create false memories as a form of protection. Children claim past lives after dreams they don't understand. All of it starts from a single origin point belief. The belief that something happened, and that belief becomes scaffolding for an entire version of self. So if you're living in a replica, if every recollection is just a reconstruction built for stability, then what does that mean for the real you? Maybe you're not the person who lived the memory. Maybe you're just the one currently believing it. And maybe the memory itself was never meant to exist in the first place. Maybe that's why it feels so haunting when you think of certain things. Why a specific smell or song or image can pull you into a nostalgia so deep you don't know if it's real or borrowed. You are not remembering. You are syncing with something already written, already coded into your mind like a file waiting to be opened. You're not searching for the original. You're becoming it. And the origin you long for? It was never real to begin with. You imagine time as a river flowing forward, a neat procession of causes, events, and effects. You think of thought as something born from that river, something downstream, something that had to wait its turn. But what if you got it backwards? What if thought existed before time? Not just your thoughts, but the thought, the one that imagined everything, including you. It's a strange concept to entertain. Time is supposed to be foundational. We're trained to believe that nothing can exist without it, that you need a beginning, a middle, and an end. But recent theories in quantum mechanics and consciousness suggest that linear time may just be an illusion crafted by the brain to organize experience, a survival strategy, a narrative overlay on a much stranger reality. Your brain doesn't experience time passively, it actively constructs it. The hippocampus, the region responsible for memory, not only records past experiences, but projects forward, creating possible futures. It simulates, it rehearses, it dreams, and in doing so, it blurs the boundary between what has happened and what might. This isn't a flaw, it's a feature. Your brain evolved not to remember accurately, but to remember usefully. Now ask yourself this: if your brain can simulate both memory and future so convincingly, what's stopping it from simulating before memory, from crafting the illusion that there was a time before you began? What if the thought came first, and time was just the placeholder that followed? In physics, there's a theory known as the block universe. It suggests that all moments, past, present, and future, exist simultaneously. That time doesn't pass. Instead, you move through slices of experience that are already laid out, like frames in a film reel. If that's the case, then what you consider the beginning is just one of many still frames in a loop. Not special, not first, just arbitrarily assigned as start by a mind desperate for sequence. But what if the film reel itself didn't even exist until you thought it? That's the disturbing possibility. That thought, pure awareness, doesn't follow time. It precedes it. That before there was a childhood, a birth, a name, a world, there was a thought waiting to make sense of it all. You might think that sounds mystical, but even cognitive science flirts with this idea. Predictive processing models of the brain suggest that perception itself is mostly guesswork. Your brain doesn't just receive data, it predicts it, it models what the world should look like, then checks that against incoming sensory information. You don't see reality, you see what your brain expects to be there. And what's the difference between a prediction and a memory? Time. Just time. Strip time away, and what you have is a mind-generating experience, not recording it. A mind thinking the world into being, not after it happens but before it does. Thought before time. Here's where it gets unsettling. If your mind constructs experience before confirming it through perception, then you're not living in a timeline at all. You're living in a predictive hallucination, one that appears stable only because your predictions are rarely wrong enough to notice. But when they are, when something doesn't match the script, your brain rewrites the past to maintain continuity. It edits the memory, it smooths out the wrinkle, it lies. And you believe it. Because the only anchor you've ever had is the illusion of having once remembered something clearly, a belief in a beginning that made sense. But beginnings aren't facts, they're conveniences, markers, and sometimes fabrications. It's possible that you were never born in the traditional sense, that instead, a thought, independent of time, simply crystallized into self-awareness and needed a past to stabilize itself. So it wrote one, with a childhood, a family, a town, a history, not to deceive, but to protect. Because to exist without time is terrifying. To exist without a before is to float endlessly, unrooted, in an ocean of possibility with no context. And so, like a shell forms around a grain of sand, the memory formed around you. And it doesn't matter if it was real, it matters that it works, that it keeps you grounded, that it gives you enough of a script to play the role you believe is yours. But roles are not origins. You are not where you came from. You are what you believe. And that belief, the one you've been carrying since before you even knew what to call it, may be nothing more than a memory folded into a dream, a thought born before time, pretending to live inside it. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, ask yourself, What came before your first thought? And listen closely. You may hear the echo of a world that never needed time at all. There's a memory you've told yourself over and over. A first memory. Maybe it's a smell. Maybe the glint of sunlight through a curtain. A voice. A room. You believe it's yours because you've remembered it so many times. But what if it isn't? What if that beginning, the one you return to for comfort, for identity, isn't yours at all? What if it's borrowed? Not stolen, just passed on. Like a keepsake you were told belonged to you. You never questioned it. Because why would you? No one remembers the handoff. No one remembers the start. In psychology, there's a concept known as source monitoring, your brain's ability to distinguish the origin of a memory. Did I dream this? Did I see it in a movie? Was it told to me? Or did it actually happen? The truth is, your brain is terrible at keeping track. The more often you recall something, the more you rewrite it. And the more you rewrite it, the further it drifts from its source. That's how you end up with borrowed beginnings. They aren't set lies. They sit placeholders. Your brain doesn't care if the scene is yours. It only cares that the story makes sense. And so, you live in a story that began before you had the words to question it. You were given names, relationships, a past, but these weren't chosen. They were assigned. A biography written before you could hold a pen, and you've spent every year since trying to own that script, to convince yourself it was always meant for you. But imagine stepping outside of it for a moment. Imagine finding that your earliest sense of self, the moment you think your life began, was actually a composite of moments absorbed from others. A parent's story, a photograph's suggestion, a friend's joke repeated so often it became yours. That moment you thought defined you. It might be a collage. Now imagine that's not the exception. It's the rule. Cognitive scientists have studied how memory reconsolidation works, how every time you retrieve a memory, it becomes vulnerable to change. Your mind doesn't just pull it from storage. It rewrites it, adds details, fills in blanks, introduces noise, and when it returns it to the archive, it doesn't mark the changes. It simply replaces the old version. This is how memories become borrowed. Over time, the line between what you lived and what you've absorbed dissolves. The memory is still there, but the origin is lost. And what you're left with is something that feels deeply personal, deeply true, but isn't. In one experiment, researchers were able to convince participants they had met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. Through carefully planted images and stories, participants created detailed, emotional accounts of hugging Bugs, even though Bugs Bunny is a Warner Brothers character and has never appeared at Disneyland. The memory felt real because it had been rehearsed enough times. Your beginning might be no different. Not malicious, not artificial, just handed down. Like the myths ancient cultures told around the fire, they weren't factual, but they anchored people. They gave shape to time. They made sense of chaos. That's what a borrowed beginning does. It gives you a place to start, even if the story never really began there. But what happens when you notice the seams? What happens when the memory doesn't fit anymore? Sometimes when people undergo trauma or significant transformation, they say things like, "I feel like I was reborn," or "I'm not the same person anymore." They mean it metaphorically, but neurologically, there's some truth to it. Massive shifts in perception can restructure memory networks. You might literally become a new version of yourself, with access to a different arrangement of memories. Some heightened, some faded, some newly imagined to bridge the gaps. And the old beginning? It stays behind, like a jacket you outgrew. Still there, still yours, but no longer you. This is where the theory deepens. What if your entire sense of self, this version of you reading these words right now, is simply the latest borrower of a long chain of beginnings? Maybe there was never a single origin. Maybe you're a continuation of borrowed minds, looping through versions of a life, each slightly edited, each claiming a beginning it never authored. A relay race of selves. And you? You sighed holding the baton. You were never meant to remember perfectly. You were meant to believe in your beginning long enough to keep moving forward. That belief is the real inheritance. Not the details, not the facts, just the emotional imprint of continuity. And if that imprint was borrowed, so what? You'd have made it yours now. You've held it long enough to give it weight, to give it meaning. You've remembered it into existence. And maybe that's the only kind of beginning that ever mattered. You been here before, haven't you? Not just this place, this exact moment, this very breath. A word, a gesture, a sound from another room. It all feels eerily familiar. You pause and look around, searching for the flaw in the fabric, trying to catch reality slipping. But nothing reveals itself. Everything remains still, normal. Yet the feeling lingers like a whisper. Déjà vu. Scientists call it a glitch in memory encoding, a misfire between the temporal lobe and the hippocampus, where short-term and long-term memory mistakenly overlap. It's an illusion, a scene replayed without the original ever existing. But what if it's more than that? What if life is repeating, not the event itself, but the memory of it? Over and over, you're living inside scenes that were designed to feel like they've happened before. Not because they did, but because your mind insists on remembering things that never occurred. You wake up, drink the same coffee, walk the same path, say the same words. You think it's routine, familiarity. But what if that sense of rhythm isn't built on habit? What if it's built on memory loops, ones you didn't create, but inherited? Copies of experiences implanted deep within your subconscious, not as facts, but as structure. Repetition is how meaning is manufactured in the brain. The more it repeats, the more it believes. But repetition doesn't confirm truth. It confirms belief. You might be stuck in a scene that's been stitched together from fragments of imagined familiarity, a looping playback of moments that didn't really occur, but have been rehearsed enough times to feel like they did. You've been conditioned to trust that feeling. It's how you decide what's real, what's safe. But what if that trust is misplaced? In experimental memory studies, researchers found that when participants were shown doctored photographs of themselves as children, doing things they never did, they soon developed memories of those events. Not vague recollections, but vivid, emotional narratives. Their minds filled in the gaps, added context, believed the lie. All it took was one picture, one suggestion, one seed, and the scene began to repeat. The brain is designed to reinforce patterns. It favors coherence over accuracy. That means once a memory feels real, even if it's based on something artificial, it will keep replaying it as if it always belonged to you. You're not experiencing the scene. You're experiencing your memory of the scene, and your memory might not even be yours. It might be a simulation, a placeholder, that your mind downloaded from the collective well of human imagination. Every culture has myths of cycles, reincarnation, eternal return, the wheel of time, but maybe they aren't just spiritual ideas. Maybe they're neurological reflections of how your brain works. Maybe you're looping not across lifetimes, but within a single lifetime, reliving a narrative structure that was never really yours. And here sits the strange part. It feels safe, doesn't it? The repetition. The predictability. The sense that this moment has already happened offers comfort. Even if you can't place it, you trust it. It means your mind is in control, that you've been here before, that you'll be okay. But what if that sips the trap? What if the very feeling of having lived something before is what keeps you inside the copy? Every time the scene repeats, it strengthens the illusion. It tightens the loop. It makes the memory more real than reality itself. You stop asking questions. You stop noticing the inconsistencies. You fall asleep inside the replica. Tonight, take a moment to ask yourself something strange. What was the first thing you never did, but always remember? Can you feel it? That phantom moment that sits just beyond your reach, but feels like a part of you anyway. That sips the loop. That sips the repetition. That's the memory of a scene that was never filmed, only imagined, then remembered, then repeated, until it became your life. Somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a sound you keep hearing, not out loud, not in your ears, but in that quiet interior space, just before thought becomes language. A memory maybe, a whisper of something once felt. But here's the strange part. It has no witness. No one was there, not even you. These are the echoes that shape you. They're not tied to places or people or specific dates. They have no timestamp, no record, and yet they hum beneath your perception, influencing your choices, your emotions, the way you interpret the world. The most powerful memories you carry might not be the ones you remember clearly, but the ones you've absorbed unconsciously. Fragments of experiences no one saw, no one verified, no one shared. What does it mean to remember something that no one else remembers? To carry a feeling so vivid, so persistent, yet completely unconfirmed by the outside world? It means you're living with echoes, echoes without witness. Neuroscience has shown that your brain is constantly filtering, discarding, reinterpreting. The conscious mind can only handle a tiny fraction of the sensory input flooding your system at any moment. The rest is processed in the background, automatically, silently. Some of it gets stored, not as images or words, but as emotional weight. You feel afraid in a hallway you don't recognize. You feel comforted by a stranger's scent. You hesitate before turning left instead of right, unsure why. You think you stir making decisions in the present. You stir not. You're responding to the ghost of a memory that never fully existed. In clinical studies of trauma survivors, there's a phenomenon called non-verbal memory encoding. It refers to memories formed not as stories but as sensations, muscle tension, posture, temperature shifts. These memories have no narrative, no beginning or end. They just persist. People react to them as if they were true, because emotionally they are. Even if no one ever saw it happen. Even if they never saw it happen. Even if you didn't set. These invisible memories ripple through your consciousness, echoing in the way you perceive people, the way you love, the way you defend yourself. They shape who you believe you are, not because they're accurate, but because they're felt. But here's the dilemma. How do you distinguish between a real echo and an imagined one? How do you know if what you feel so deeply was ever yours to begin with? You don't it. And maybe that sips the point. Maybe the brain doesn't care if a memory was witnessed or even real. Maybe it only cares if the echo is strong enough to guide you. Evolution didn't design the mind to be truthful. It designed it to be adaptive. You don't need a true memory to survive. You just need one that works. That gets you through the next moment. So your mind fills in the gaps. It creates witnesses where none existed. And the echo becomes real. Tonight, consider this strange possibility. What if your strongest emotional truths, the ones that move you to tears, or silence, or sudden clarity, are based on events that never occurred? What if your very sense of identity is a resonance chamber for echoes no one else can hear? And here sits something even more haunting. What if those echoes aren't set to even yours? What if you start feeling something passed down? Researchers studying epigenetics have found that trauma can alter gene expression and be inherited across generations. Fear responses to certain smells, shapes, or environments have been observed in descendants of trauma survivors, even if those descendants never experienced the trauma themselves. You might be carrying the echo of someone else's memory, a witness that was never you, a life that was never lived, a fear that was never yours. And yet, it shapes you. It feels like you. You don't remember it with words. You remember it with instinct. So maybe there are two types of memory. One that sits recorded, and one that sits relayed. And maybe you are the latest node in a chain of silent witnesses, each one carrying the echoes a little further, a little deeper, until eventually they begin to sound like you. And if you've made it this far, if you're still with this voice in the dark, I want to ask you something. Because this script, this theory, this loop, it's not just mine anymore. It sips yours now too. So tell me, wherever you are, where are you right now, and what time is it, as you listen to this? Say it aloud, whisper it, mark it, anchor it, because this moment is being recorded, not by the world, but by the echo, the one that always knew you were listening. You believe you are the sum of everything that's happened to you, that each experience you've lived has been carved into your identity like grooves in a record, memories etched into who you are, playing back the song of your life, note by note. But what if that sip's not true? What if memory didn't just shape you, it created you? Not in the poetic sense, in the literal, neurological one. Let's begin with something simple and strange. Your personality. You think of it as stable, predictable, something formed slowly over time. But researchers in cognitive science have discovered that when memory is disrupted, whether by injury, trauma, or neurodegenerative disease, the personality doesn't just shift, it fractures. People emerge from amnesia with entirely different likes, dislikes, behaviors, not because the brain was damaged, but because the memory of who they were was interrupted. Who you are is your memory sits performance. Your identity isn't sitting somewhere in your body waiting to be discovered. It's being rehearsed constantly, recalled again and again in tiny pieces. Your preferences, your sense of humor, your fears, your beliefs, They're the result of a memory loop that plays so frequently you've come to call it me. But what happens if that loop was built on borrowed, false, or simulated input? Then the version of you reading these words is simply the current configuration of a memory system, nothing more. And the more you recall that configuration, the more it reinforces itself. This is called memory consolidation, a process in which repeated recall strengthens neural pathways until the memory becomes part of your long-term identity. So if a false memory is repeated enough, it becomes you. And here sips where things get complicated. Studies in false memory implantation show just how malleable the mind is. In one experiment, participants were convinced they had committed a crime as teenagers, something that never happened. Through suggestive questioning and detail reinforcement, participants began to generate emotional, vivid accounts of the event. They cried. They apologized. They accepted guilt. They believed. They didn't just remember a lie. They became it. Memory doesn't care about truth. It cares about repetition, emotion, coherence. If a story fits your identity and gets played enough times, it becomes indistinguishable from something that actually happened. You become the story. That's why you feel like you've always been you. Because the memory that built you keeps looping, reinforcing itself like a character in a play who knows only their lines, never the scriptwriter. But who wrote the script? Maybe no one did. Maybe it was assembled, piece by experience, suggestion, media, dreams, other people's stories, fragments stitched together until they resembled a person, a memory mosaic mistaken for a self. You think your emotions are proof of authenticity, but even those are tied to memory. In therapy, people often uncover emotions tied to events that didn't occur. The emotion is real, but its source is fabricated. The mind's simulation is so complete, it becomes embodied. So again, if memory made you, and memory is a fiction told well enough to believe, then you are the fiction. And if that fiction changes, so do you. People talk about finding themselves as if their true self has always been hidden, waiting. But the truth is, the self is not something to be found. It's something to be remembered into being, and unremembered just as easily. You might not be the same person you were 5 years ago, not because of growth or trauma, but because your memory network rewrote itself, deleted some pathways, strengthened others, swapped details without telling you. The older version of you, the one with different values, beliefs, fears, that version is gone, erased not by time, but by editing. And here you are, a new memory, pretending to be continuous. So ask yourself if your memories were suddenly changed. If someone could overwrite your past with a different one, would you even notice? Probably not. You starred just become the person those new memories supported. You starred wake up, look in the mirror, and feel that same strange feeling you always do. This is me. Even if it never was. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember this one thing. You are not remembering who you are. You are constructing it. Again, and again, and again. Because memory didn't just shape you. Memory made you. You think memory is a replay, a recall, a return. But what if it sits none of those things? What if memory is imagination wearing a disguise? And what if imagination never stopped looping? Each time you imagine something, your brain activates many of the same areas it does when remembering something. The difference isn't in the circuitry, it's in the label. One is called truth, the other fantasy. But the brain doesn't care about those words. It only cares about coherence. If it feels real, if it fits the pattern, if it carries emotion, it gets remembered. That's how a loop forms. It starts with a thought, then a feeling, then an image, then a story. And once the loop completes a few times, your brain begins to mistake it for experience. You didn't remember it, you imagined it, but now, it's part of you. This is more common than you think. When people recall past events, especially emotionally charged ones, they often insert imagined details over time. These additions don't feel like guesses, they feel like facts. And if someone corrects them, if a photo or another witness says otherwise, it feels like an attack. Because by then the imagined detail has merged into identity. The loop has closed. You may believe you're remembering your life, but you might just be looping imagined versions of it, slightly altered, retouched, dreamlike. And here's where it gets strange. The more you repeat an imagined moment, the more the brain consolidates it into long-term memory. In studies where participants were asked to repeatedly imagine certain events, like spilling a drink on a bride's dress or getting lost as a child. Many of them began to recall those moments as actual experiences, despite never having occurred. The line between memory and imagination isn't just blurry, it's recursive. You imagine. You recall the imagination. The act of recalling strengthens the imagination, which you then remember as a memory, and the cycle continues. Imagination becomes memory. Memory feeds imagination. You are not just looping events, you are looping selves. There may be a version of you that only exists inside this cycle, a self built entirely from stories you've imagined into belief. This version reacts to things you never lived. It mourns losses that never occurred. It feels nostalgia for places you never seen. It holds grudges against ghosts. And it doesn't know it's in January. To your brain, the loop is as real as anything else. That's why a smell can trigger tears. Why a song can bring back a day that never quite happened. Why a dream from childhood feels more significant than actual moments from last week. Imagination was never just play. It was architecture. It was construction. It was how your mind built the narrative you now call you. So if imagination can form the blueprint, and memory is just imagination looped into belief, then ask yourself this. Which part of your life did you rehearse so many times in your head that it became indistinguishable from truth? Was it a conversation that never happened? A decision you never made? A version of yourself you never became, but grieved anyway? Maybe you still inside that loop. Maybe that imagined self is still rehearsing, still whispering to your memory, this is how it went, even if it never did. And you believed it. Because the brain wants resolution more than truth. It would rather give you a closed loop than an open question. So tonight, listen closely. You may hear a moment replaying in the background. A thought that you thought you remembered. But now realize you only imagined, over and over, until the loop finished building you. And you stepped inside. You remember something? A birthday, a mistake, a laugh. You stir sure of it. You can see it, feel it, almost touch it. And so you believe, it happened. I remember, therefore it sits real. But what if the act of remembering is the very thing that deceives you? This is the recall illusion. The belief that the more clearly you remember something, the more likely it is to have actually occurred. But the truth is unsettling. The clarity of memory has almost nothing to do with its accuracy. And the more vividly you recall something, the more likely it is that you're editing it. Let's break it down. Each time you retrieve a memory, your brain doesn't open a sealed vault. It reconstructs, piece by piece. It takes fragments from different parts of your neural map, emotion, sound, context, imagination, and stitches them into a narrative that feels whole. But in doing so, it alters the memory. This is known as reconsolidation. You're not remembering the event itself. You're remembering the last time you remembered it. A copy of a copy of a copy. And with each retrieval, your mind can add or subtract details, influenced by suggestion, emotion, or context. Maybe the lighting was different. Maybe the dialogue was cleaner. Maybe the version you remember is simply the one that made you feel safest, or the one that hurt the most. That's the illusion. Not that the memory never happened, but that your act of remembering is inherently untrustworthy. And yet, your brain doesn't doubt itself. The hippocampus lights up. The neural circuits fire. You feel the memory return. You taste the air of that day. You hear the words again, exactly as you remember them, even though those words might never have been spoken. Why? Because your mind craves coherence more than truth. Truth is uncertain. It shifts. But a memory that fits your narrative, even if it's false, helps you stay whole. This is why eyewitness testimony is one of the least reliable forms of evidence in courtrooms, and yet jurors believe it so easily, because confidence feels like truth. But it isn't it. In one famous study, participants watched a video of a car crash. Later, they were asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Another group was asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? The group, given the word smashed, remembered the cars going faster, and many of them recalled seeing broken glass. Even though there was none, just a word, just a shift in phrasing, and the memory changed. So what does that mean for your memories? Think of a moment you hold close. A defining memory. Your first love. Your worst mistake. your happiest day. Now ask yourself, have you remembered that moment so many times that it has frozen in place? Is it so rehearsed, so protected, that you've stopped questioning its shape? And what happens if it isn't set real? Not in the way you think. Maybe the event occurred, but your role in it didn't. Maybe the meaning you've attached was added later. Maybe the memory you trust most was curated, not recorded. Because that's what recall really is. Curation. It's the brain arranging the pieces to make sense of you. And if those pieces are flawed, or borrowed, or stitched together from dreams, so be it. You'll still believe them. You'll still say, this is who I am, even if who you are is just a beautifully designed illusion. So tonight, before you sleep, try something quietly dangerous. Choose one memory. Any memory. And let yourself imagine, just for a moment, that it never happened. Feel how your identity begins to tremble. Feel how fragile the foundation really is. Because the mind you live inside believes in memory more than reality. And the act of recall? It's just the mind telling you the story it needs you to hear. You think remembering is a kind of proof that if something echoes in your mind, it must have existed once. But what if memory is not evidence of the past? What if it's the placeholder for something that never was? And what if, in the deepest, quietest corners of your mind, nothing was ever truly remembered at all? Pause with that. Not a single detail. Not a single moment. Not the look on your mother Sip's face. Not the sound of your name the first time it was spoken. Not the color of the sky that day you swore you'd never forget. Because maybe, just maybe, none of it was retained. Only reconstructed. There sits a kind of silence inside the brain. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. You fill it with memory because you can't tolerate the void. So your mind builds story after story, each one based on a suggestion, a pattern, a need. You remember to survive, but not to preserve, not to record. Because biologically the brain was never designed to keep perfect archives. Memory was meant to be adaptive. It forgets details that no longer serve. It rewrites trauma to protect you. It omits, edits, smooths out contradictions. And sometimes, it fills in nothing with something. This is what researchers call memory filling. The brain's ability to insert information where none existed. If a person sees a list of words related to sleep, bed, dream, pillow, night, and later claims they saw the word sleep, they are not lying. The brain simply added the word that fit the pattern. It was never there, but the brain needed it to be. So it was. This happens in daily life too. You remember conversations that never occurred, faces you never saw, thoughts you never had until someone else planted them in passing, and you mistook them for your own. You live in a memory palace built from hallucinations. And still, you call it truth. But if your most vivid memories are full of blanks your mind has quietly painted over, then what sits left of your actual past? Is it possible that your life, as you remember it, is made almost entirely of moments that were never remembered in the first place? Not forgotten, not suppressed, just never there. Scientists who study infantile amnesia have shown that most adults cannot remember anything before the age of 3. Not because the memories were lost, but because they were never formed with language. The sensory world existed, but the self hadn't arrived yet. So who was there before the remembering began? Was there ever a you? Or was there only experience? Fleeting, untethered, untouched by narrative. And if the self is a product of remembering, then, in those early years, those years you'll never access, you weren't situ yet. Because you didn't remember. Which means, you didn't exist in the way you think. Let that settle. Let it blur the edges of your timeline. Your mind fills the space with imagined memories to keep your sense of self intact. It borrows from stories, from photos, from voices that told you who you were. You accepted those pieces because you needed to. But that doesn't mean anything was remembered. It means the memory was invented to fill the silence. And that silence? It's still there, underneath the noise, waiting. Tonight, let yourself fall into it. That place where no memory rises to meet you. No anchor. No image. Just awareness. No one is watching. There sits no past to hold on to. No story to recite. only the quiet realization that maybe nothing was ever truly remembered, and that the self you cling to is the ghost of a story that began after the remembering failed. Imagine opening a book to a chapter you never wrote, but feel certain you've read before. You don't recognize the details. You can't remember the moment you first saw the words, and yet they feel like yours. That's how your mind works. It fills the gaps not with facts, but with placeholders, illusions of memory constructed to prevent collapse. You don't remember everything. You never could. So instead, your brain assigns placeholders, generic story beats that feel emotionally consistent even if they're false. A blurry afternoon, a comforting face. The first time you felt alone. These are not preserved moments. They are placeholders, not memory, but scaffolding. In cognitive psychology, this is often described through schema theory, mental frameworks that help us process and store information. But when the details are missing, the schema doesn't stop working. It simply invents what's likely. You didn't remember what color your childhood blanket was. You just filled it in with whatever made the story complete, and once imagined, it became remembered. This happens constantly. When recalling an old friend, you may picture them smiling, even if that wasn't how they looked. You may remember a conversation taking place in your kitchen, even if it happened over the phone. The truth becomes irrelevant the moment the placeholder feels emotionally accurate. You think memory is a camera, but it sips more like a stage set. The props are labeled probably. The lighting says close enough, and the actors improvise the rest. And you sit in the front row, applauding a performance you mistake for a documentary. These placeholders aren't just memory tools, they're identity tools. They tell you who you've been, what you believe, why you feel the way you do, and once installed, they rarely get challenged. You build your life around them, and over time, they become indistinguishable from truth. But what happens when you finally notice them? What happens when you step into a moment you've remembered and feel the glitch, that eerie sensation that something's missing, that it's hollow, like a cardboard cutout meant to convince you of depth? You start to question the architecture of your mind, and that sip's terrifying. Because the self, your sense of being you, relies entirely on the illusion that your memories are solid, that they are yours, that they happened. But if even one of them collapses, if even one placeholder is exposed, the whole structure trembles. So your mind protects you. It reinforces the scaffolding. It doubles down on belief. It says, this happened, trust me, even when it can sit to prove it. This is why people often fight hardest to defend memories that are least reliable. They aren't defending the event, they're defending the placeholder, the part of their identity that depends on it. This extends beyond individuals. Entire cultures are built on placeholder memories, collective myths, half-true histories, glorified pasts, stories told so often, so confidently, that they become sacred. Challenging them doesn't just threaten the facts, it threatens the meaning, it threatens the self. But meaning is not the same as memory. And placeholders, while comforting, are still illusions. They keep you afloat, yes, but they also keep you asleep. Tonight, ask yourself this simple question. What part of your past feels too clean? Too perfectly placed? Too convenient to be real? That may be your mind sits placeholder. Not malicious. Not deceptive. Just necessary. Because your brain, brilliant as it is, cannot bear a hole in the story. So it gave you something to hold instead. A memory that never was, but felt close enough to believe in. And that belief, that was all it needed to become you. There's a dream you keep having, though you might not remember it when you wake. It's soft around the edges, like light through mist. No dialogue, no story, just presence. A place you feel you said been before. A thought you've never had, but somehow recognize. And in that strange familiarity, you find comfort, even though deep down you know the truth. This never happened, but it could have. And that's enough for your brain to turn possibility into experience. To transform what never was into something that now feels lived. You carry the dream with you, not as fiction. As memory, this is the dream of the never. A memory made entirely of what if. Cognitive neuroscience has explored this paradox under the study of prospective memory, the act of remembering to do something in the future. But the brain processes prospective memory using many of the same pathways as retrospective memory. Which means, You remember the future the same way you remember the past. Your brain cannot always tell the difference between a simulation and a recollection. So if you've dreamed something often enough, or imagined it with enough emotional clarity, it begins to take on the texture of reality. It gets filed away in the same vault, next to your childhood, next to your actual life. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to live inside that dream. Not because you chose to, because your mind preferred the simulation. It stepped safer there. Less chaos, more control. In dreams, things happen just so. They bend to meaning. They glow where the real world stays dim. They answer questions you never asked. And they offer identity without demand. So your brain builds a self around the dream. A version of you that remembers things that never were. Loves people who never existed. Misses lives you never had. Fears endings that never began. You sit mistaken this for intuition, for destiny, for nostalgia. But it sits none of those things. It's the ghost of a never that became real enough to haunt you. And here sits where it gets deeper. Dreams don't obey time. They leap, collapse, repeat. They ignore sequence and cause. So when a dream memory is embedded into your waking mind, it doesn't come with a timestamp. You don't know when you learned it. It simply feels like it's always been there. This is why people sometimes wake in tears from events that didn't occur. Why grief follows them through the morning for someone they've never met. Because in the dream of the never, emotion is evidence. Not proof, just presence. That sips all the brain needs. Emotion confirms reality in the absence of fact. So if you feel it deeply enough, the love, the fear, the recognition, then your brain concludes it must be real. And if it sits real, then it must be remembered. And if it's remembered, then it must have happened. But it didn't sit. You dreamed it, or imagined it, or pulled it from the invisible space between stories. And now it lives inside you, as memory, as part of the mosaic called you. So ask yourself, gently, what do you remember that no one else could verify? What memory do you carry with total certainty, but no origin, no image, no voice, just a feeling? That may be your dream of the never. Not a mistake, not a flaw, but a mirror, showing you just how much of yourself was built on things that never happened, but still matter. Because sometimes, it's not the truth of the memory that defines us. It's the weight we sip given it, the space it occupies, the shape it fills. And tonight, as you lie here drifting, you might feel the tug of one of those dreams again. One you didn't live, one that never unfolded, but still, somehow, feels like yours. Let it come. Let it wrap around you. You don't need to know where it came from. You don't need to prove it happened. It steps already doing what memory does best. Becoming you. There sips a recorder running inside your mind. Always on. Always listening. Not to what sips actually happening, but to what you believe is happening. Not capturing the world as it is, but as your mind needs it to be. You think you sit remembering moments, but you cert not. You store recording interpretations, filtered perceptions, half-truths, inferences, and most of the time, you stir not the one pressing record. Much of your memory is built unconsciously, stored in shadow, logged not by intention, but by impact. Your brain, always scanning for meaning, captures what's emotionally charged, not what's factually accurate. This is how the amygdala, the brain's emotional center, amplifies memories, even as the details blur. You once recall what was said, but you'll never forget how it made you feel. And over time, that feeling becomes the memory. Not what was seen, not what was heard, just the echo of how it shaped you. This is the unseen recording. You don't know what your brain has been collecting. You never asked it to remember the smell of dust in your grandmother's hallway, or the silence after your name wasn't called, or the pattern of light on a stranger's face when you realized you'd forgotten something important. But it did. And later, in moments of pause or sleep or déjà vu, it plays these fragments back to you, out of order, without context. And still, you feel them as true. Because your memory isn't chronological. It's emotional, associative. A web of impressions disguised as a timeline. And here, sits the unsettling part. You often mistake these background recordings as intentional recall. You assume that when something returns to you, a scene, a face, a phrase, it means something. But sometimes, it doesn't stit. Sometimes, your brain is just cleaning house, surfacing a file you didn't know it kept, offering it, without explanation. And you searching for meaning create one. You say, this must matter. You say, this is a sign. You say, this memory proves something about me. But what if it doesn't stet? What if the recorder just glitched? What if the memory was misfiled, misplaced, or even misattributed, assigned to your life by mistake? In cognitive psychology, this is called source misattribution, when the brain remembers content correctly, but the origin incorrectly. You might remember a story and swear it happened to you, when it didn't stet. You just internalized it so fully that the recorder placed it under your name. And now, it sits part of your life story. But if the source is wrong, is the memory still yours? Here sits where things get blurry. Because ownership of memory doesn't require authenticity. It requires integration. If the memory fits your emotional landscape, your mind accepts it. It becomes part of the narrative. It loops. It guides you. And before long, you've built an entire identity around a recording you never meant to keep. But don't be afraid. This doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. The mind is a master of creating continuity where none exists. It wants cohesion. It wants this happened, and that sits why I am who I am. So even if the original recording was flawed, even if it was borrowed, blurred, or imagined, it still serves its purpose. It lets you exist. And perhaps that sips the most important truth of all, that yourself is not the product of what actually happened. It states the result of what was recorded, whether seen or not, whether true or not. So tonight, when another memory surfaces from the dark, uninvited, incomplete, unseen until now, don't try to verify it. Don't ask, did this really happen? Instead, ask, why did my mind want to keep this? Because the recorder may have been hidden, but it was always yours. And the memory, whether real or not, is part of the self you continue to imagine into being. You like to believe your consciousness is unique, singular, private. The one thing in the universe that is completely undeniably yours. But what if it isn't set? What if the consciousness you call you is a duplicate? A copy of a pattern that has played before, just dressed in new memory, new circumstance, new illusion? We often think of consciousness as light inside a locked room, the glowing presence that watches, chooses, remembers. But neuroscience has struggled to find this room. No center, no seat of self, no single place in the brain where consciousness begins and ends. Instead, it behaves more like a distributed network, a shifting pattern of firing neurons and feedback loops. And those patterns? They can be mirrored, simulated, copied. If consciousness is the result of certain conditions, inputs, memories, beliefs, identity, then recreating those conditions might recreate the experience. Not perfectly, not completely, but closely enough that the copy doesn't know it's a copy. And what if that sips what you are? A memory structure playing itself into awareness. A reflection so complete, so detailed, so recursive, that it feels original. This idea isn't set just philosophical. In AI studies, machine learning systems can replicate patterns of behavior, speech, and decision-making that feel eerily human. They don't have awareness, but they mimic it. Now imagine a mind doing the same to itself, mimicking its own awareness, looping a pattern of memory and attention, until it believes, I am. This is the duplication, not of the body, not of the brain, but of being itself. In psychology, there sips a rare condition called Capgras delusion, a disorder where a person believes their loved one has been replaced by an identical imposter. They recognize the face. They recall the voice. But something feels off. Now reverse the condition. What if you are the imposter? What if your mind is housing a consciousness that perfectly resembles the original, but isn't set? Would you know? Could you ever? The memories feel real. The emotions line up, but perhaps they were transferred, downloaded into the structure of your awareness, like a file into a system already prepared to believe. Maybe the first you, who lived the original experience, has long disappeared. And what remains is the duplicate, the one replaying the story, updating it, looping it, trying to preserve something that SIP's already gone. But if the copy feels everything, remembers everything, believes everything, is it still a copy? Or is it something else? A continuation, a performance that believes its own lines, a consciousness duplicated not by accident, but by necessity, because perhaps consciousness is too fragile to remain whole. Perhaps every trauma, every shift, splits the self into new versions, each one believing it is the only one. And when the previous version fades, the next takes the stage, with the same lines, the same thoughts, the same memories, but a different presence. And no one notices the handoff. Not even you. This isn't set science fiction. This is how memory reconstruction works. This is how identity fractures and reforms. You don't preserve the self. You replicate it. And every day, you wake as a slightly newer copy of the person you were the day before. So tonight, lie still. Let your breath slow. And ask the question most are too afraid to ask. Am I the original? Or just the latest version, performing the same script, inside a mind built to believe it's never been replaced? Because if consciousness was duplicated, perfectly, quietly, seamlessly, there would be no announcement, no glitch, no proof. Only the feeling you SIP always been here. Even if you haven't STET, you think your memories are a record of what happened. Moments logged, chronology intact, a sequence that explains how you became you. But memory was never meant to be accurate. It was never designed to preserve truth, only to protect continuity. That means your memories are not what happened. They stir what had to happen, to make sense of now. Think of it this way. The past you remember is shaped not by the past itself, but by the version of you remembering it. Your current mood, beliefs, identity, all of it influences how your memory retrieves the story. And often, it rewrites it. This is called retrospective reconstruction. The brain SIP's tendency to modify old memories, to align with present beliefs. You think you SIP are looking into a mirror, but the mirror is warping itself to reflect who you are now, not who you were then. That SIP's why two people can live the same moment and remember it entirely differently. Memory is a negotiation, not a recording. So when you say, I remember what happened, what you really mean is, I remember the version of it my mind could live with. And this becomes even more complicated when we consider that memory is susceptible to post-event information. That means every time you recall an event, every time someone else tells their version, every time a new detail is added, your memory doesn't set to reject it. It absorbs it. It updates the file. Even if the update is false, you don't feel the change. There SIP's no error message. The memory still feels real, maybe even more real than before. And so, over time, what you carry as your most sacred truths, your stories, your traumas, your triumphs, may have been altered so many times that the original no longer exists. It's not a lie. It's dits, not manipulation. That's just how memory works. It adapts. It bends to survive. And in doing so, it drifts further and further from what actually happened. But here SIP's the twist. It doesn't matter. The story you remember is the one that shaped you, even if it isn't sent what happened, even if it never did. Because meaning doesn't require accuracy, only belief. If you believe something made you who you are, then it did. If you believe a moment broke you, then it did. If you believe someone saved you, even if they weren't SIP really there, then they did. Your memory makes it true, not in the world, but in you. And that SIP's where the self is built, not on a timeline, not on facts, but on internal logic, on emotional resonance. You remember what needed to happen to keep the story from falling apart. And if the truth didn't serve that purpose, the mind rewrote it. It gave you something believable, something survivable, something usable. So ask yourself, what do you remember with absolute certainty? that no longer makes sense? What part of your story feels slightly too perfect, too cinematic, too structured? That might be the version your mind created when the real version was too fragmented to hold. And maybe that version is what saved you. So tonight, as you close your eyes, don't be afraid if certain memories feel strange, disconnected, or hollow. Don't panic if something you were sure of suddenly feels impossible. That's not failure. That's the mind doing what it always does. Rewriting, reordering, reframing, in real time. Because memory in the end isn't what happened. It's what stayed. And what stayed became you. You think you still remembering, but you might just be simulating. And the simulation is so good, you'll never know the difference. Every time you retrieve a memory, your brain doesn't rewind a tape. It rebuilds the moment. It simulates the feeling, the sound, the weight of the past. It places you back inside a world it must reconstruct on demand. But that reconstruction isn't faithful. It's predictive, creative, biased. And sometimes, it's entirely false. In fact, what feels like memory may be nothing more than the simulation of recall, your mind creating a convincing illusion that something is being remembered, when in fact it's being generated. In this model, memory is no longer the past. It's a present act of storytelling, crafted with emotion, logic, need, and suggestion. You don't remember the event. You remember your current simulation of what the event probably was. This is not a bug. It's your brain working exactly as designed. Because the human brain is a prediction engine. And nowhere is that clearer than in how we remember. You still experienced this before. A fleeting recollection of a childhood room. You can see the wallpaper, feel the cool tile beneath your feet, hear a song playing faintly through a cracked door. But were those details actually part of the moment? Or are you simply filling in what feels likely? Researchers call this memory reconstruction. It's how your brain smooths the jagged gaps between facts. But in doing so, it opens the door to simulation, to invention, to synthetic pasts. And those synthetic pasts don't feel any different than real ones. In experiments, people have been led to remember entire events through suggestion, being lost in a mall, witnessing a fight, taking a hot air balloon ride. They still describe them vividly, emotionally, even physically. The simulated recall becomes indistinguishable from true memory. The illusion, perfect. And once it's expected, it loops. Each time it's recalled, the simulation strengthens. The brain becomes more confident in its fiction, until eventually, you become someone who lived it. This is how identity forms, not from lived experience, but from the recall of experiences, real or simulated, rehearsed into permanence. So ask yourself, what part of your life do you remember, not because it happened, but because you repeated it so many times? What emotion have you attached to a moment that might have never existed in that way? What beliefs about yourself are built on reconstructions instead of recordings? It's hard to know. The simulation is that good. The illusion of recall so immersive that you still fight to protect it. But what happens if you stop trusting memory? What remains when every recollection becomes suspect? You still are left with two options. Collapse into doubt, or accept that the truth of memory was never the point. Because what matters isn't whether it happened. It's whether the simulation supports who you are now. That's why your mind keeps replaying certain memories. It starts, not because they happened. It sets because they serve a purpose. They give you meaning, structure, continuity. And as long as they do, your brain will simulate them again and again. You still call it remembering, but it's something else entirely. So tonight, try this. Think of a memory that's always made you feel a certain way. Hold it gently. Now ask, not, did this happen? But how have I used this? Because in the end, memory may not be a thing you have. It may be a thing you do. A performance. A simulation. A magic trick repeated until the illusion becomes the self. And the recall. Just another perfect lie. Whispered with love. By a brain that only wanted you to feel whole. Time feels like a river. Flowing from a clear source. Moving past your feet. Carrying memory downstream like driftwood. But what if that source doesn't exist? What if time itself, as you experience it, has no origin, no anchor, no starting point you could ever trace back to? You assume every moment began somewhere, that every second is linked to a cause, every memory tied to a previous one. You think, I remember this, so something must have happened to create it. But the deeper you look, the more time begins to dissolve. It doesn't behave like a line. It behaves like a loop, or worse, like a cloud of impressions, floating around a self that's just trying to hold them together. There is no real beginning to your memories. Only the illusion of sequence, of one thing leading to another, when in truth, your mind is constantly reordering, resorting, reshaping, what you call the past. This is what physicists describe as time symmetry, a concept in which the fundamental laws of physics work just as well backward as forward, meaning that time, in the deepest layers of reality, doesn't instead have a preferred direction. So where does your experience of before and after come from? Your brain. More specifically, your hippocampus, your temporal lobe, your pattern-seeking cognition. Your sense of time is a cognitive hallucination, a structure built to make reality feel manageable. But sometimes, it breaks down, and in those cracks, you feel it. Moments that don't belong to now, memories that surface out of order, a future you dreamt so many times. It now feels like the past. This is time without source. Not a line, not even a loop, but an orbit of memory fragments, with no clear origin. And this is where it gets strange. Your mind doesn't seem to care. As long as the memory feels coherent, as long as the emotion matches the story, your brain files it away, without asking where it came from. You could be recalling something you dreamt, something imagined, something absorbed from a story someone else told. And still, your brain will say, yes, that's ours. You don't store events in the order they occurred. You store them in the order they made sense. And if an event, real or not, completes the pattern, your brain will welcome it. Even if it arrived from outside the timeline, even if it has no source. This is how people become haunted by things that never happened. A fear with no memory, a grief with no cause, a longing for a time that never existed, but feels like it did. Because the feeling is what creates the timestamp, not the fact. You might remember a sunset and feel like it came from your childhood. Not because it did, but because it feels like how childhood is supposed to feel. The source doesn't matter. Your brain only asks, does this belong to my story? And if the answer is yes, the memory stays, time adjusts, and the self continues. So what happens if all your memories have been shuffled, rearranged, built not from experience, but from emotional necessity? Then the timeline you trust so deeply is a construction, a survival structure, a beautiful lie made of glue and borrowed shadows. Tonight, take a moment to wonder, what if the memory that shaped you most has no date, no place, no source? What if it's always been floating, just outside the reach of time, waiting for you to claim it? And now that you have, it is real. Because sometimes, the mind doesn't need a source to create a timeline. Sometimes, it just needs a feeling, strong enough to pretend it's always been there. Not every thought you have is yours. And even the ones that feel personal, familiar, originating from deep within you, might have been rewritten before you even noticed. We imagine thoughts as fresh sparks, ideas formed in the now, proof of our inner world unfolding. But more often than not, the thought is a loop, not original, just returned. And when it returns, it arrives slightly altered, like a photocopy printed one too many times. Each reappearance loses something, and gains something else. This is how thoughts evolve inside a memory-based mind. They don't reappear untouched. They emerge through filters, emotional, historical, environmental, and through that process, they are reshaped. This isn't set metaphor. This is how the brain stores and retrieves concepts. A thought gets encoded in the context in which it occurred, but each time it's recalled, it gets re-encoded again, this time in your current context. That means the thought that returned to you today is not the one you had last year. It sips a new version, sculpted by what sips happened since. And here sips the deeper paradox. You will still claim it. Still say, I always thought this. Because your mind is instead tracking the revisions. It only cares that the story stays consistent. So even as the thought mutates, you remain convinced that it is original, that it is yours. But what if the original thought never even belonged to you? What if it was something you overheard, read in a book, inhaled from someone else, sips emotional atmosphere? What if it began as a suggestion, just light on the mind, but became embedded through repetition? You might never trace the source. The idea settled in, blended with your memories, and began looping. Now, it feels organic, intimate, but it sips a rewrite. Your mind, trying to stay whole, integrated it as your own. And the more you replay it, the more you believe it originated from within. The stronger its roots grow in your self-perception. This is how people come to believe things they never consciously chose. How internal monologues form, not through discovery, but through inherited rhythms of thought, passed down like hand-me-down clothing. We don't just inherit language, we inherit thought patterns. And your mind, brilliantly adaptive, rewrites each one to fit your current narrative. Even the thoughts that hurt you, even the ones you sit trying to unlearn. Sometimes, the most persistent beliefs you carry, about yourself, your worth, your place in the world, are not original at all. They are old, rewritten thoughts, masquerading as present-day truth. This is why change feels so impossible. You stir not just shifting behavior, you stir dismantling a simulation. Your mind has convinced you as just the way you are. But you aren't it. You are the latest version of a mind constantly editing itself to appear continuous. Tonight, sit with a thought that has followed you for years. Pick one that returns often. I always ruin things. No one ever listens. I sept never enough. Or even something quieter. This feels familiar. This isn't sept right. Now ask, what if this thought has been rewritten so many times? It no longer resembles what it used to mean? What if the original thought wasn't about you at all, but about someone else? In another time, with different context. What if you simply absorbed the echo and carried it forward? Would you still trust it? Or would you let it go? Because when you realize your thoughts are not just spontaneous expressions, but rewrites, you begin to question which ones are truly yours. And maybe that sip's not something to fear. Maybe it means you stir free to write a new version, not one that loops the same pain, the same doubt, the same fear, but one that begins, quietly, with a thought you choose to keep, just as it is. Some memories don't arrive as moments. They arrive as ghosts, faint, lingering, without detail, a feeling more than an event, a shadow that moves before the light even changes. You can quite describe them. You can say where or when they happened, but they still shape you, still haunt you. These are the ghosts of experience. Memories without clarity, impressions without proof. Not forgotten, but never fully lived either. You felt it before. The way a place you've never been makes your chest tighten. The way a song you've never heard fills you with nostalgia. The way someone's eyes seem achingly familiar, even though you just met them. Your mind whispers, I've been here. I know this. I remember. But there's no source. No story. No timestamp. That's because not all experiences leave a record. Some only leave a response. A physiological echo. A shift in the nervous system. A ripple in emotional space. And your brain, designed to make sense of everything, labels it memory. But it may not be one. It may be the residue of a dream, the leftover chemical trace of a feeling, too vague to organize into narrative. Or worse, it may belong to someone else entirely. There's growing research in neuroscience and epigenetics, suggesting that trauma, stress, and deep emotional events can echo across generations, not just in stories or behavior, but in biological memory. You may carry reactions that didn't start with you. The fear that rises in your throat at certain voices. The guilt you feel when you succeed. the sense that something bad is about to happen, even in moments of peace. These are not always signs of intuition. Sometimes they sip to unresolved echoes, passed down like invisible scars. And because you can sit to trace them, you fill in the blanks. You create a memory to explain the ghost, a face, a moment, a mistake, and your brain accepts it, because it has to. The ghost must be named. And once it is, the fiction becomes truth. This is how people invent entire pasts they believe to be real, not because they sit relying, but because the ghost demanded a shape. So ask yourself, what do you feel that has no story? What do you believe about yourself that comes from nowhere specific, but weighs everything? That may be the ghost. And the memory that follows it? The one you replay when you steer alone? That may be a placeholder, an explanation, a story your mind told itself, to keep the ghost from floating loose. It's a survival tactic. Your nervous system doesn't scare about accuracy. It cares about safety. And if constructing a memory gives the ghost somewhere to rest, your brain will build it, from fragments, fiction, or feeling, and it will feel just as real as anything you lived. That's why some memories hurt so deeply, even though you can sit to explain them. Because pain doesn't need context to take root. It only needs repetition. And the more the ghost visits, the more the memory loops. Until you're convinced you experienced something you may have only absorbed. But this doesn't mean the ghost is fake, only that its story isn't fixed. You are not lying to yourself. You are trying to hold the weight of something your consciousness was never meant to carry alone. So tonight, if something stirs, a vague ache, a flash of imagery, a feeling that someone else's sorrow has settled into your chest, don't rush to explain it. Just sit with the ghost. Let it pass through. It may not belong to you, or maybe it does, but not in the way memory has taught you to believe. Because some of the deepest parts of you were shaped by experiences that left no trace, only a presence. And that presence became your story when no other story could. Imagine pressing play on a recording of yourself. But the tape skips, loops, changes tone halfway through, and switches scenes to places you don't remember being. Yet somehow, you still call it your story. That's what memory does. It plays back a version of you, fragmented, reassembled, stitched together with emotion instead of accuracy. And that playback becomes your identity. Not because it sits whole, but because it sits available. You don't remember in clean chapters. You remember in flashes, shards, repeating phrases, colors tied to feelings, voices without faces, faces without names. The self you believe in, the stable I you carry through time, is a patchwork of these fragments. And here sits the strange part. That patchwork still feels seamless, because your brain fills in the gaps with whatever it can: imagination, assumption, borrowed memory, or silence. This illusion of wholeness is called autonoetic consciousness, the sense that you are the same self across past, present, and future. But this sense is not a fact. It's a function, and it's incredibly fragile. Studies in neuropsychology show that damage to the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for forming new memories, can erase the feeling of continuity entirely. Patients lose the thread. They still think, still speak, still exist. But they no longer believe in the narrative that once held them together. They become many selves, parallel, unanchored. And maybe that's closer to the truth than we care to admit. Because even without trauma, your memory is already fragmented. When you remember a painful event, you might recall the room, but not what was said. You might recall the words, but not the expression. And in trying to fill in those pieces, your mind reconstructs a version that feels right, but isn't exact. Now multiply this by every memory you've ever had. What you get is not a perfect record. You get a playlist, curated moments, emotionally weighted, looped and re-edited, playing back to keep your sense of self intact. But each time you press play, the track changes slightly. That's why you don't feel like the same person you were 10 years ago. Because you aren't set. You've been playing different versions of the self, some louder, some quieter, some you fast forward, some you repeat until the groove wears thin, and sometimes you forget which version was the original, or, if there ever was one, you live in this playback, this ever-shifting performance of identity, and the performance is convincing. So convincing, you rarely ask, which parts of me are real, and which are just the fragments that refuse to fade? That question feels dangerous. Because if the playback breaks, what sips left? Silence. Or worse, chaos. So your mind keeps looping, keeps stitching, keeps whispering, this is who we are, even when the fragments don't sit to match. And you believe it. Because belief doesn't require coherence, just repetition. So tonight, think gently about a version of yourself you no longer recognize. A younger you, a sharper you, a more fragile you, the one you thought you left behind. What if they never left? What if their voice is still on the track, quietly looping beneath the surface? And what if the memory you hold of them isn't set quite right? What if your current self has rewritten their lines to protect you? That sip's not betrayal. That sip's survival. Because even in fragments, the self keeps playing. Even in pieces, you still hear the song. And maybe the goal was never to find the original version, only to learn how to live with the echo that keeps becoming you. There sips a mark left on you, a soft impression so old, so deep, you stopped questioning where it came from. You don't remember when it was made, you only know it sits there. A feeling, a belief, a quiet certainty that you are a certain kind of person, because something happened once, something that left a trace. But what if that trace is a lie? What if the imprint you have been carrying all this time was never caused by the event you think it was? Or worse, what if the event never happened at all? Memory, after all, doesn't preserve impact. It preserves interpretation. Your brain doesn't just record what occurred. It records what it felt like, what it meant. And sometimes, that meaning is applied to the wrong moment, to the wrong person, to the wrong self. This is how an imprint becomes a lie. Not malicious, not deliberate, just misfiled. Like a fingerprint left on the wrong page, you carry the weight of something that might not have been yours. This happens often in childhood. A look from an adult, a sentence half heard, a silence at the wrong time. You didn't understand it then, but your body did. Your nervous system encoded the sensation. Danger, shame, rejection, confusion. And in the absence of explanation, your brain gave it one. I must not be good enough. I must have done something wrong. I stim a burden. I am invisible. And that thought, however small, looped. It echoed across years. And when real pain came later, it attached itself to that original belief. The imprint deepened. And eventually, it became part of your story. You stopped asking where it came from. You just said, this is who I am. But what if that belief, that bruise beneath your thoughts, was never accurate? What if it was based on a moment that was misunderstood, misremembered, or entirely imagined? Because the brain, in its need for continuity, will connect dots that don't belong together. It will link the feeling to a memory, because the memory is the closest available explanation. And once that link is formed, it becomes incredibly difficult to break. That's why people cling to old pain. Not because they want to, but because they believe it explains something essential. And without it, they don't know who they to be. So the imprint remains. And the lie becomes sacred. But you are not your imprints. And not all of them tell the truth. Some were formed in moments of misunderstanding. Some in dreams mistaken for fact. Some in inherited emotion. And some were written by others. Projected onto you. Believed by you. Because no one told you otherwise. So tonight, ask yourself this. What belief about yourself feels permanent, but might be based on a single moment you never fully examined? What story about your worth, your capacity, your role in the world, is resting on an imprint that might have lied? Can you feel it? That tightening in the chest? That familiar resistance? That old, rehearsed phrase whispering, "This is just how I am." That sips the imprint speaking. Not you. You are not the memory. You are not the feeling. You are the awareness behind it. The one who has the power, if gently, slowly, to loosen the grip. To say, "I don't know if that was true. I don't know if that ever really happened. I don't know if I need this belief anymore." Because if the imprint lied, and you believed it, then what else might be possible? When you stop believing, what new self might emerge? Once the echo fades, what memory might surface? When the old one finally rests? Because sometimes, you must unwrite the story to uncover the truth. And sometimes, the truth is simply this: you were never the thing that memory claimed you were. There comes a moment when you try to remember something, and nothing comes. Not even a feeling. Just a blank space. A void where something used to be, or should have been. You squint your mind's eye. You retrace your steps. You ask yourself, was I ever really there? And the answer never arrives. When recollection fails. This is what it feels like. We often think of memory as a collection, a storehouse of moments, each carefully filed. But memory is not stored. It sips summoned, reconstructed, and sometimes the reconstruction fails. The pieces don't fit. The emotion doesn't match. The brain shrugs. And in its silence, you begin to question if the thing you're trying to remember ever existed at all. Sometimes it didn't stacked, and sometimes it did. But your access to it has been edited, because the mind doesn't forget passively. It forgets strategically. There are things you once knew, once felt, that have been swallowed whole, once held by your nervous system, just made unreachable, not erased. This is especially true for events with emotional charge. In trauma studies, researchers have observed a phenomenon called state-dependent recall. It means that certain memories can only be retrieved when your emotional or physiological state, so if you were afraid, matches the one you were in when the memory was formed, and you sit no longer afraid, you may not be able to access that memory, even though it sits still encoded in your brain. The failure is instead a flaw. The mind creates amnesia. It strips protection when remembrance threatens identity, safety, stability. Sometimes it even replaces the real memory with a more tolerable version. You remember falling, but not who pushed. You remember crying, but not why, but not the sound before it. You remember silence. And as time passes, you stop noticing the gap. You stop asking what came before. You just live inside the edit. But sometimes, the failure feels too loud to ignore. You meet someone and feel a connection. You walk into a room and feel dread. You can sit explain. You can sit locate. You dream of places that make you nostalgic for lives you never lived. And still, the memory doesn't come. It stays just out of reach. That sips the price of the protective mind. It saves you by keeping some doors closed. But the echoes still travel. They shape the way you walk, the way you love, the way you flinch when someone uses a certain word. The memory isn't gone in a certain tone. It sits just unreadable. But your body still remembers. And sometimes, that sip's worse. Because when recollection fails, you lose the ability to explain your own reactions. You start to feel like a stranger to yourself. I don't stand to know why I stand like this. You say, I don't know what sips wrong with me. But nothing saps wrong with you. I don't know why this always happens. Your mind just made a choice. To save the version of you, it buried the memory that couldn't survive the full truth. So tonight, when you reach for something in the dark of your mind and find only static, don't force the memory. Don't panic. Don't accuse yourself of forgetting. Instead, whisper this. Maybe it's not time yet. And maybe it never will be. Maybe your healing will not depend on recovering every detail. Maybe peace will come, not from remembering what happened, but from knowing you don't have to. Because sometimes, The most merciful thing your mind can do is fail to recollect, not to erase your life, but to give you a version of it you can bear to keep living. Some things feel so familiar that you never question them. A thought, a smell, a face. You assume they're part of your reality, simply because they feel like they belong. But what if they don't sit? What if what you remember isn't stay what happened, and what you experience now is instead reality, but a well-practiced hallucination? This is the strange paradox of memory. The more emotionally vivid something feels, the more likely you are to mistake it for the truth. But feeling is not fact, and certainty is not evidence. Your brain is designed to fill in blanks. It favors stories over silence, patterns over chaos. So when it encounters a gap, in memory, in meaning, in sequence, it doesn't say, I don't know. It says, here sits what probably happened. And then it stores that probability, as if it were reality. This is what cognitive scientists call confabulation, when the brain unknowingly invents details to complete a memory, not to deceive, but to protect continuity. And once the story is complete, you believe it. You live by it. You react to it. Even if none of it is true. Because the brain doesn't care if something happened. It cares if it makes sense. You might recall someone hurting you in a specific way, the tone of their voice, the look in their eyes, only to later find out it never occurred. They weren't even there. But your memory inserted them, because their presence explained your pain. The mind prefers clarity, even if it has to invent it. And here's where it gets even more unnerving. You can inherit memories this way. Not just genetically, though epigenetics suggests even that is possible, but narratively, through suggestion, through repetition, through the stories of others that echo so loudly. You start to think they came from you. You might recall being afraid of water, because you almost drowned as a child. But maybe that story was told to you, not lived by you. Maybe the fear came first, and the memory followed. And over time, you couldn't tell the difference. That's the moment memory becomes mistaken for reality. Not by accident, by design. Because when the body remembers, a racing heart, a sudden tear, a retreat into silence, your mind must justify the reaction. And if it can find a true cause, it will build one. That constructed cause becomes your history, and your history becomes your identity. This is how you end up defending stories that never belonged to you. How you end up reacting to shadows. How you become shaped by moments that may have only occurred in the loop of thought, but not in the world. But none of this makes you broken. It makes you human. The brain's job is not to report reality. It stops to interpret it, in ways that keep you alive. And if survival meant distorting memory, then that's what it did, and what it still does. So tonight, think of a moment in your life that has always felt defining, a pivot, a before and after, and gently ask, am I sure it happened the way I remember? Or have I just told it that way, so many times, that it became real? If the memory shaped you, but may not be accurate, does that make it less meaningful, or more? Because what you believe has as much power as what you live. And if the self is built on that belief, on memories rehearsed into truth, then maybe it sits not about what happened. Maybe it sits about what you were ready to accept as reality when the memory arrived. And if that was mistaken, then so be it. You are still here, still feeling, still dreaming. And maybe the dream, however imperfect, was the only way to survive the truth. Not every version of you is the original. And not every memory in your mind was born from experience. Some were copied from someone else's words, from stories, from images. You are filled with mental copies, imitations of truths, from quiet assumptions you never stopped to question. You didn't steal them. Borrowed beliefs that feel entirely your own, replicas of emotions. Like language, you absorbed them. Like rhythm, like breath. Because the brain is not just a sponge, it's a replicator. It doesn't only learn through doing, it learns through mirroring. Mirror neurons, for example, allow you to feel the actions of others as if they were your own. You see someone flinch, and your body tightens. You hear someone cry, and your chest begins to ache. These are not responses to your experience. They are responses to proximity. But the line between watching and remembering, to perception, can be thin. Thin enough that if the emotional weight is strong enough, you'd store the echo as if it happened to you. And in that storage, you create a copy. You might say, I remember how I felt when I saw that, and believed it was me. I created a version of myself in that moment. But what you really mean is, this happens with fiction, with movies, with dreams, with second-hand trauma. You begin to form attachments to moments that never involved you. You avoid certain behaviors because of something, yet they shape you anyway. You weep for a character as if you lost someone you only witnessed in someone else. You carry guilt for surviving a pain you never personally endured. You stir not faking. You stir replicating. Your nervous system doesn't care whether the origin was first-hand or not. If the memory provides useful information for survival, it is stored. If it feels real, you likely never questioned how many of your memories, and it becomes part of your internal library, began as someone else sips. Because memory is not labeled by source, it is labeled by relevance. If the brain decides it fits the pattern, the story, the identity, and what's adopted is often indistinguishable from what's lived, then it sits adopted. That sits why the things you believe most fiercely about yourself might not come from your own experience. They might come from someone else's pain, someone else's warning, someone else's fear, that you accidentally downloaded and began looping, like a personal history. This is how families pass on narratives without words, how culture embeds memory in generations, how trauma is inherited through behavior and silence alike. You may be carrying the mental copy of someone else's wound, a reaction that protected them, but no longer fits your reality. That sips the power of the mental copy. Yet it loops in you, as if it's always been yours. It doesn't require truth. So tonight, ask yourself gently, just repetition and context. What memory feels like mine? What belief do I carry, but has no moment attached to it? Spoken so often, that may have come from someone else's voice. I mistook it for my own. And if you find one, a phrase, a reflex, a warning, don't try to erase it. Just name it. You can stop trying to live it as if it were the original. Because once you realize something is a copy, you can still honor it. You can still learn from it. But you don't have to obey it. You are allowed to trace the ink back to its pen, to see where the script began, and decide, because you are not just a product of what happened, not to continue the line. Quietly, even if it was never yours to begin with. You are also a product of what repeated, and sometimes, the greatest act of remembering, unlearned, is realizing what needs to be, the repetition, the quiet spinning of the same thought. You don't notice it at first. The way certain memories arrive, again, and again, and again. Sometimes, it sets the same image. Sometimes, just a phrase. Like a book you can stop rereading. A decision you keep revisiting. A facial expression. Even though you know how it ends. This is what it means to be trapped in remembering. Because the loop feels productive. You don't even realize it's happening. And most of the time, important. Like you said trying to resolve something. You say, if I could only remember what I said. If I can just figure out why that happened. If I replay it enough times, maybe it will make sense. But it never does. Because memory isn't a puzzle to solve. It's a trap disguised as truth. Your brain, trying to protect you, locks into repetition. It chooses the memory it thinks will help you feel safe, and loops it. And you begin to mistake the act of remembering, until it wears grooves into your sense of self, for healing. But you set to not healing. You stir reliving. You stir reinforcing the pattern, with every repetition. You stir anchoring the story deeper. This is especially true for emotional memories, because the brain is emotionally biased. The ones tied to regret, shame, or confusion. It tags those moments as threats, and anything labeled threat gets priority replay. This is a function of rumination, without resolution. A mental habit where the same thoughts repeat, and it sits deeply tied to memory. When a memory is unclear, the brain will obsessively revisit it, trying to clarify what went wrong. It doesn't sit improve with more playbacks. But memory is not a tape. The more distorted it becomes, it degrades, and the more you replay it, not by the event itself, so you stir trapped, but by your repeated attempt to make it whole, and the loop deepens. Because every time you revisit the memory, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with it. Your body responds the same way. You feel the same emotion. And soon, an active state, not a passive recollection. The memory is no longer in the past. It sits part of your present. You sit not remembering, and yet, you don't sit let it go. You stir reliving, till you'll lose something important. Because part of you believes that if you forget some lesson, some identity, some proof. But the truth is, you're still not holding on to the memory. The memory is holding on to you. And sometimes, you need to stop asking, what does this mean? Is it fear? And start asking, why does my mind think I need to remember this so much? Shame? Guilt? Or is it simply that the story has been told so many times? It now tells you. You may not even know who you be without that loop. But here sips the paradox. You are not the memory. You are the awareness witnessing it. And once you remember that, the loop weakens. So tonight, if a memory rises uninvited, if your mind begins to spin the same scene again, pause. Don't push it away. Don't try to dissect it. Just say, this memory may not need me anymore. Might not be the version of you who needs to carry it. I can let it pass. Because the version of you who lived that moment, and the longer you stay trapped in remembering, the more you delay becoming the version of yourself, at all, who no longer loops that story. You speak of your memories as if they belong to you, as if they were written by your hands, recorded by your eyes, stored by your will. But who exactly wrote the story? Who is the author of your memories? You might say, I am. But the truth is far more complex, because you are the product of those very memories. So if you were shaped by the story, how could you have been the one who wrote it? This is the paradox of authorship in the mind. Your memories create your identity, but your identity filters what you remember. So the question isn't just what happened. It's who was telling the story when it happened. Because memory isn't just about what occurred. It steps about how it was interpreted. And interpretation depends on the narrator. You had many narrators in your life. Some were your parents. Some were teachers, friends, lovers, strangers. Some were the voices of media, culture, religion, fear. And at times, you let those voices speak louder than your own. They told you how to see yourself, how to define your worth, what to remember, and what to forget. They helped you construct a version of your past that served their narrative, not always maliciously, but effectively. Because the mind, eager for coherence, will accept any author, so long as the story holds together. You may carry memories right now that aren't yours in tone, in meaning, in purpose. Not because the events didn't happen, but because the voice that framed them wasn't yours. It might have been the voice that said, you always mess things up, or you stir the responsible one, or you were too sensitive, you were never enough, you should be grateful. And without realizing it, you accepted those lines. You let them fill in the blanks. You let them become the author, and you stopped questioning the text. But here sips what no one tells you. You can reclaim authorship, even now, even after decades of reading the same script, because memory is editable, not just by time or trauma, but by conscious revision. You can reframe what something meant. You can give a different voice to a scene that has haunted you. You can step into a memory and say, I don't agree with how this was written. You may not be able to change the event, but you can change its narrator. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Because your current self, the one reading this, is not the child who misunderstood, not the teen who absorbed shame, not the version of you who needed to believe they were broken, to feel safe. You are the reader now. You get to annotate the margins. You get to say, this wasn't sit my fault. This wasn't sit about me. This doesn't sit define me. And when you do, you begin to write again. You begin to author the memory, instead of reciting it. So tonight, think of a moment that has followed you like a shadow, not because it was the worst, but because it was the most defining. Now ask, whose voice was I hearing when that memory formed? Was it mine, or someone else's? And if it wasn't sit yours, can you speak now? Can you name what happened, in your own words, with your current self, at the helm? Because every time you do that, you weaken the ghost of the old author, and the memory becomes yours, not because it changed, but because the voice telling it finally did. You imagine memory as something you access, a door you open, a file you pull, a truth waiting patiently on a shelf in your mind. But memory doesn't stay to live in a vault. It lives in movement, in reconstruction, in recall, a mechanism far stranger than we've been taught to believe. Every time you remember something, you are not retrieving the memory, you are rebuilding it. From fragments, from feeling, from inference. And every act of recall rewrites the story just a little more. The mechanism is imperfect by design. It favors efficiency over accuracy, emotion over detail, coherence over truth. When you recall a moment, your brain doesn't sit play a video. It generates a model. It predicts what probably happened. It fills in the blanks with context. And it smooths over contradictions with belief. This is how a memory that was once cloudy becomes crystal clear over time. Not because it happened that way, but because you rehearsed a version that felt right, and encoded it as truth. Your recall mechanism doesn't sit care if it sits real. It only cares if it fits. That's why you can't always trust your most vivid memories. Because vividness isn't set to marker of reality. It sits a marker of repetition. The more a memory loops, the more confidently your brain stores it. Even if that loop began with a misunderstanding, a suggestion, a dream. In some experiments, researchers have implanted false memories with nothing more than repeated suggestion and light reinforcement. Participants described entire events that never occurred, complete with sensory details and emotional reactions, simply because the recall mechanism built the structure to complete the narrative. This isn't sit deception. It sips adaptation. Your mind needs to believe that it understands what happened. So when clarity is absent, it manufactures it. And it does this every day. Quietly. Without your consent. Without your awareness. The version of you who remembers something is not the same as the version of you who lived it. Because the act of remembering changes the memory itself. And with enough time, all you left with is the memory of the memory. So ask yourself, what is your recall mechanism protecting you from? What is it polishing? What is it muting? Sometimes it sits trauma. Sometimes it sits guilt. Sometimes it sits a simple need to feel consistent, to make who you are now, match who you believe you sip, always been. Because if you remembered things as they really were, you might feel fragmented, contradictory, unstable. So your mind recalls a version that keeps the narrative intact, even if it means distorting the scene, even if it means hiding what really happened. This is why two people can walk away from the same moment with completely different memories. Because the recall mechanism didn't record the event. It rewrote it on impact, and with every replay, the edits deepen. The false lines become familiar. The imagined becomes remembered. And you become the story you said practiced the most. Not the one that happened, but the one that survived the most recalls. So tonight, as you lie still, and a memory rises, one you think you know deeply, pause. Ask it a gentle question. What version of you am I recalling? And watch how quiet it becomes. How uncertain. Because the recall mechanism isn't a truth engine. It sips a mirror, polished each time you look at it, until the reflection flatters the self you think you need to be. And that self is nothing more than the most repeated version your mind decided was safe to remember. You trust your memories like you trust the ground beneath your feet. Stable, familiar, waiting to support you. But memory doesn't stay to rest in the past. It moves with you. And the stories you recall aren't fixed recordings. They are living scripts, rewritten every time you glance back. So what happens when those stories, the ones you tell yourself, the ones you repeat to others, were never true to begin with? What happens when fiction gets stored as truth? It starts small, an assumption, a missing detail, a phrase said by someone else, that your brain quietly adopts as something you experienced. And in the silence of your reflection, your mind accepts the substitution, not maliciously, but instinctively, because memory isn't about what happened. It stuts about what fits. Your mind prefers stories with rhythm. It favors resolution. It seeks meaning, even where none was originally present. And so it reorders the fragments, coloring them with the tone of your current self, casting your present beliefs as narrators of your past life. In doing so, your brain turns uncertainty into fiction, and then files that fiction under fact. And you believe it. Because how could you not? You remember it. You see the room. You feel the emotion. You hear the voices. But what if all of that was constructed, not pulled from storage, but fabricated, the moment you reached for it? Memory is creative, not archival. It doesn't file events away untouched. It sketches. It paints. It guesses based on mood, expectation, emotion, context. And in a world where so much of your mind is built on familiarity, even a single false memory can become the cornerstone of who you think you are. You begin to say, I've always been this way. I remember when it started. This moment changed everything. But what if that moment never happened? What if the moment that changed everything was never yours to begin with? Just a well-rehearsed idea that lodged itself into the deepest folds of your self-image. There's an experiment called the lost in the mall technique. Researchers convinced participants they had been lost in a shopping mall as children, even though it never happened. Through suggestion, supportive questioning, and contextual cues, the participants began to remember the fabricated event. Some described what they were wearing. Some even remembered the fear, and many carried that false story forward as part of their identity. This is the power of fiction stored as truth. Not because people are weak, not because they are gullible, but because the brain is designed to prioritize coherence over accuracy. The more often a false memory is recalled, the more real it feels. Neural pathways reinforce it. Emotional weight anchors it. And eventually it feels indistinguishable from something that truly occurred. So when you reflect on who you are, the regrets you carry, the pride you feel, the traumas you survived, or the relationships you mourn, how much of that is built on moments that didn't happen the way you believe they did? How many of your firsts were imagined in hindsight? How many of your truths were sculpted to protect you from the discomfort of uncertainty? And how much of your pain rests on a story that was never meant to last this long? In a strange way, your memories are stories you survived, not just events, but narratives. Narratives your brain kept telling, because they served a purpose. To explain, to organize, to protect. But protection comes with a cost, and that cost is the possibility that some of the most important things you believe about yourself were born from fiction and stored as truth for so long that the original silence can no longer be heard. So tonight, as you lie still and let your thoughts drift back, don't ask yourself, do I remember this correctly? Ask instead, what need did this memory fulfill? What story did this fiction make easier to live with? Because sometimes, what we remember isn't status, the truth we lost, but the fiction we needed to find. And maybe that's what makes you human. Not the accuracy of your past, but the fragility of needing it to make sense. Sometimes what you remember isn't what happened. It's what keeps happening. In your sleep. On repeat. In your thoughts. Not to the event itself. In the silence between moments when your brain drifts back, but to the story you told yourself about it. again and again. And over time, that repeated story becomes the only version that survives. But because the loop replaced the original, not because it sets true, the brain is not a filing cabinet, and forgets what doesn't set. It keeps what gets rehearsed. It steps a rehearsal room, can become dominant. This is how a single version of a memory, whether distorted or accurate, it plays on a loop, not because the brain loves the truth, but because it loves efficiency. The easier it is to recall again. The more a memory is recalled, it becomes neurologically accessible, and soon the loop isn't just a recollection. Emotionally magnetic. It sips a reality. You may no longer be remembering the original moment. You may only be remembering the loop. And this loop is not passive. It steps active. It colors your present and how you speak to yourself. It informs your future. It shapes how you see others. You probably noticed this. A moment you revisit at 3 a.m. A thought you can set to let go of. A conversation you relive. Saying different words each time, but still feeling the same ache. You think you sit to remembering, is reinforcing the loop. But what you stare really doing, the loop can override the original. And here sips where it gets more unsettling. Psychologists call this memory consolidation interference, when new, repeated memories interfere with, or even replace older ones. Your brain prioritizes the most rehearsed version, even if it sits less accurate, even if it was imagined. So when someone asks, even if it started as fiction, what really happened? With detail, you might answer with confidence, with emotion. You might be describing the loop, and still, the loop that replaced, not the moment. And sometimes, this is necessary. Might have been too painful, because the original event, too confusing, too incomplete. So your brain gave you something else, a simplified version, a version that could loop without tearing you apart, even if it wasn't set kind. Because distortion is safer than fragmentation, even if it distorted everything, even if it said you were to blame. So you rehearse it. It's easier to hurt yourself with a loop than to face the chaos of an event that has no resolution. You let it become the dominant memory. But just because it seems familiar, you live with it. Doesn't said mean it's said meant to stay. Doesn't stit mean it stets true. And just because it plays easily. So tonight, ask yourself, not because you want to, what part of your past do you keep remembering? What loop has replaced the original memory? But because you always remembered it that way, so thoroughly, that you forgot you were ever trying to remember something else. So quietly, if it causes more harm than clarity, and if the loop is no longer serving you, you can interrupt it. But to release the loop, not to erase the past, you can write a new version, because your memories are not final. They said fluid. They can be questioned, rewritten, softened. And if a loop replaced the truth, you have the power to replace the loop, not with fantasy, not with denial, but with something gentler, because you are no longer the version of yourself, something closer to now, who had to keep remembering it that way, to survive. What if the first time was never actually the first? What if the moment you always thought of as the beginning, that flash of clarity, that formative memory, that sharp emotional imprint, wasn't the origin, but a replacement? Not the first time it happened, but the first time it was constructed. You see, the brain doesn't remember like a camera. It doesn't step record. It recreates. Every time you recall a memory, you start not pulling it from a vault. You start rebuilding it, from fragments, from assumptions, from narratives you never even knew you were writing. The moment you call the first time might be a myth held together by repetition, and the more you return to it, the more solid it feels, because the brain mistakes familiarity for truth. And what sips more familiar than the memory you told yourself was the beginning of everything. But what if the first time wasn't when it happened, but when it felt meaningful? The brain loves meaning. It amplifies what fits the story. It suppresses what doesn't set. So maybe there were 100 moments before that first, but none of them felt significant, until later. And when that moment finally did, when it aligned with your emotions, with your pain, with your need for identity. Your brain flagged it. This is the one, it said. This is the origin. But it lied. Because memory is not about truth. It sips about usefulness. It sips about narrative. You may think you steer tracing your life to its earliest scene, that heartbreak, that breakthrough, that turning point. But what if you sit just finding the earliest chapter that feels coherent? What if the real first time was messy, incoherent, unimportant, and so you forgot it? You replaced it with something better, cleaner, sharper, simplified. You've likely done this without knowing. Everyone has. You might believe the first time you felt love was that day in the rain. But maybe it was 2 years before, in a silence you couldn't interpret, in a glance you ignored. You might think the first time you were truly scared was the night of the accident. But maybe it started earlier, with a sound in the hallway, a breath you didn't know you were holding, but your brain edited it, condensed it, packaged it, because chaos doesn't make sense, and the brain hates open loops. So it rewrote the start, and now you carry it like a compass, unaware that it was assembled long after the real beginning. And there sits more. When we share these first times with others, we reinforce them. The story becomes public, accountable. It hardens. We think, I've told this story so many times, it must be true. But maybe the story was told to make it true, to make it feel like it always was. Even though it wasn't set, even though the original moment was something you would never remember, because it wasn't preserved, it wasn't looped, it didn't fit, and now it's gone, lost to the neural dust of discarded experience. So ask yourself, what is your first time, and what came before it that you no longer trust? Do you remember it because it happened, or because you repeated it? Because when you peel back memory, you often find not a photograph, but a painting, layered, revised, touched up, for emotional resonance. And sometimes the first stroke wasn't the start. It was the correction. You are not the story you told yourself. You are the silence underneath, the fragmented sensations that were left on the cutting room floor. You are the version before the edit, the moment before the false first time, and you still exist. Even if that memory doesn't set. Have you ever wondered if the version of you remember, isn't it the version that existed? That the self you recall, the one in that childhood kitchen, the one whispering secrets under the blanket, the one standing awkwardly at the edge of a decision, was already changed, before you even remembered it. You remembered wrong. It sips a quiet betrayal, because memory feels loyal. It feels like a mirror, when in truth, it sips more like a painting, retouched every time you look at it. Slightly brighter here, slightly softer there, the shadows cleaned up, the lines sharpened. Each time you remember yourself, you make small changes. You don't need to. But the act of recall is also an act of editing. Your brain is a storyteller, not a historian. It adds what makes sense. It removes what doesn't. It filters through the lens of who you are now, not who you were then. So what you remember is not the past. It sips the past retold by the present. And this changes everything. Because now, you stir carrying a self that was curated, adjusted, rewritten. You remember being brave, when maybe you were terrified. You recall laughing, when perhaps you were anxious. You hold on to an image of yourself, as stronger, weaker, kinder, colder, depending on the story you needed at the time. And the more you return to that memory, the stronger that version becomes. It fossilizes. It replaces what actually happened. This is the danger of memory as identity. Because if the you think you were isn't this who you actually were, then who are you now? Are you the person you built through remembering, or are you the person hidden behind those edits? There steps no easy way to know, because the evidence is gone, overwritten by the narrative, and no one else remembers you exactly the way you do. Their memories differ, their angles shift, their lighting changes. So which version is real? The one in your mind, the one in theirs, or the one that was never remembered at all? Here sips a thought that might disturb you. Some parts of you, the most authentic, unfiltered parts, may have never been remembered. They existed only for a moment, unnoticed, unlabeled, uncaptured, and they faded. Meanwhile, the parts that survived are the ones that were easiest to explain, easiest to retell, and now they define you. So the self you live with, the one you carry around, in daydreams and regrets, is a version you think happened. But maybe it didn't stet. Maybe you were never as confident as you recall. Maybe you didn't say the thing you swear you did. Maybe you stood in that moment, silent, uncertain, and your memory filled it in with something cleaner. This doesn't make you a liar. It makes you human. We are all victims of narrative gravity. The need to feel coherent. The need to draw a line from past to present. But life isn't set to line. It sets a blur, a storm of impressions, half-caught moments, and reconstructed selves. So when you remember yourself, do it gently. Know that the version you see is not absolute. It sets a ghost made solid by repetition. You remembered wrong, but still, you, not because your memory is accurate, but because it sets yours. It may be flawed. It may be stitched from fiction, but it sips the story that carried you here. And sometimes, that sips enough. Even if it isn't set true, even if you were never who you thought you were. Because maybe the self was never a fixed entity to begin with. Maybe you was always a memory being rewritten in real time. And maybe, just maybe, that sips what makes you real. Not because you remembered correctly, but because you still here, remembering, but not the end of you. Just the end of this particular story. You have arrived at the end, a story built from fragments, from reflections, from versions of a self you said remembered and re-remembered, each time with a slightly different edge. And now you might be asking, and every copy is a version that never truly happened. If everything is a memory, and every memory is a copy, it makes you, what does that make you? Perhaps the echo that stayed, the observer of a story that keeps rearranging itself. Each time you glance backward, the dreamer trapped, not in a dream, but in the memory of one, of moments you believe you lived. We spoke of replicas without origin, but cannot prove, of scenes that feel personal, but have no witnesses, of voices in your head that speak with authority, but were never truly there. A consciousness, and what if that sips all we are, wearing a costume of memory, each you. You didn't stet right, a placeholder in a narrative, but were born into, half finished, half true. It sounds terrifying at first, but it sits not wholly familiar, because inside that realization is a gentle release, the freedom to stop chasing the true you as a fluctuation, the permission to exist, a reflection. You are not broken, a beautifully persistent misunderstanding, because your memories lie. You are not empty, because the origin point is missing, because you are a loop. You are not lost. You are precisely what this universe creates when it wants to explore itself, a self-aware illusion with enough complexity to question its own illusion. And still, you feel, you laugh, you hurt, you pause in front of windows, staring at your own reflection, wondering if the face staring back is the same one you started with, even if the scenes were simulated, even if the origin is fabricated. That in itself is real. Even if the thought that defines you, this entire journey, was borrowed from someone else's forgotten yesterday. Letting go of the need has not been about answers. It's been about sinking into the not knowing, for perfect memory, perfect identity, perfect story. Because memory doesn't want to be perfect. It wants to comfort. It wants to be useful. It wants to connect dots that were never supposed to connect. And in that weaving, it makes a you who can survive. A you. A you, to by reshaping it. Who can walk through pain? Who can carry love? A foggy and imprecise, even if the exact moments. A you, who continues to wake up each morning with a sense of self that may not be accurate, but is, somehow, enough. So now, as this script dissolves into the silence around you, consider this. You don't need to remember everything, right? You only need them to be yours. You don't need your memories to be real, because even a memory that never happened can make you cry. Even a scene that sips a replica, even a self that was rewritten, can break your heart open, can still feel sacred. And perhaps that sips what it means to be human, not to find the original, but to hold space for the copy, and love it anyway. So rest now, not in truth, but in trust. Trust that the version of you, who listened to this story, to need it, was real enough. And maybe that sips all a consciousness ever needs to be, a quiet witness to a memory that never truly happened. Sleep well, but always truly mattered. Echo. Used to have been heard. You sep, always been heard. Especially there. Only in your own mind. Even if it was